So UV radiation can break some chemical bonds. What chemical bonds it can break, it depends on the strength of the bond. All right, but basically what happens, if you just look at this picture, this is a model of a molecule that has 3 atoms in it, and the bond between the atoms in the molecule is modeled with a spring. And a lot of times chemists use springs to model bonds because even though, you know, in the Lewis structures we use little dashes. Dashes give the impression that bonds are very static and that the atoms are fixed in place, but really they're not. Atoms are kind of moving relative to one another back and forth, kind of like oscillating back and forth like a spring would, and depending on the temperature and a lot of other factors, the oscillations vary. So what happens then is with the ultraviolet light, this is just a model of ultraviolet light coming towards a photon of ultraviolet light coming towards a molecule and just happening to interact with that molecule right at the point of the bond, interacting with the bond and then breaking the bond. Okay, and so this molecule disassociates. That word means disassociate is to come apart. It's no longer associated, and that's sometimes a word that we use when we say a bond breaks. It disassociates. And so so this is just an example of how ultraviolet radiation interacts with matter. And you can even imagine for yourself this molecule is ozone. Okay, and the bond strength, the electrons, and remember in this bond we're modeling it as a spring, but again remember we know that there's 2 electrons that are localized you know, between these 2 atoms, holding these 2 atoms together in space, and those electrons are what gets disrupted when the ultraviolet radiation, the energy from the photon in the ultraviolet radiation, you can imagine, knocks these electrons out of the space in which they reside, causing the molecule to come apart. So this, in this way, this is how we model that ozone, the concentration of ozone can be correlated to the amount of ultraviolet radiation reaching the Earth, because if the ozone is present, then the ultraviolet radiation, the photon of ultraviolet radiation, is going to be absorbed by the molecule, and that energy that's associated with that photon of that ultraviolet radiation is going to be transferred into chemical potential energy and go with the molecule. Some of the energy may be transferred then further onto heat or kinetic energy, but whatever, the major result is that the ultraviolet energy is going to be transformed into a different type of energy. So if you think of the ultraviolet energy coming down through that column, being absorbed into the bond, breaking the ozone, and then the ultraviolet, that particular photon of that ultraviolet light would no longer be present. It has transformed into a different type of energy, so it's not going to make it to a detector. So if you have a detector down here at the bottom of the Earth, a UV detector, if you have more ozone molecules, they're going to absorb the UV, and less UV is going to make it to the surface of the Earth. So that's what's happening to the ultraviolet radiation in the presence of ozone. So I just sort of answered my question. What's so special about ozone is that it's absorbing that ultraviolet radiation. Now, the question is, that's just the case of ozone. The question is, well then, if ultraviolet light is capable of breaking an ozone bond, why doesn't ultraviolet radiation break all bonds? And or is all the ultraviolet radiation the same? Now, if you think about visible light, we know that visible light isn't all the same. You can see its a spectrum, the rainbow. You can see the different wavelengths, and now we know that there's different energy associated with the different wavelengths. The red is longer wavelengths, so that I would assume that that has lower energy associated with it, and the violet is of shorter wavelengths, so that should be higher energy photons associated with it. So, so is that the same true with ultraviolet radiation? Is all ultraviolet radiation of the same energy? So we'll take a look at that, answering that question in our next lecture, in lecture 16.